So, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining and for registering. This is today's webinar. Can AI ever be a careful and competent driver? Safety, ethics, and evidence in automated driving. So, this is a timely discussion because the automated vehicle pilots are expected, well, in spring. I think we're almost through spring, but certainly in 2026. And recent consultation responses have also closed. And so we're at a really important point in deciding what evidence will be needed to show that an automated vehicle is not just technically capable, but genuinely safe, responsible, and acceptable on public roads. And so a key question that we wanted to surface in this webinar is whether we can prove this either through simulation, whether through real-world testing, or whether we need a careful combination of both. And crucially, even if the evidence is technically strong, is the public going to be convinced? I'm Dr. Clare Mutzenich. I'm Professor of Practice in Human AI Interaction at Loughborough University and founder of Anthrometric. And my work focuses on human factors, public trust, inclusive design, and the real-world implications of automated transport. And I'm delighted to be joined today to moderate today's discussion with Professor Saber Fallah, who's from University of Surrey, and his work focuses on safe, intelligent, and connected mobility systems. So I'm going to introduce our panel today, who's probably very well known to everyone. We're joined by three excellent speakers. Our first is Dr. Nick Reed, founder of Reed Mobility, and he brings a deep expertise in ethics, standards, and the wider policy framework for automated vehicles. And his work has included work linked to the Automated Vehicles Act and government science advice. So welcome, Nick.
Hi, thanks, Claire.
Next, I'm joined by Jamie Hodsdon from Waymo. He's policy manager for UK and Europe, and he's bringing the perspective to this panel of an automated vehicle service provider, including how the industry thinks about safety, evidence, and can tell us a bit about the responsibilities of an authorised self-driving entity. So welcome, Jamie.
Thanks, Claire.
Finally, we have Professor John McDermott, co-director of the Institute for Safe Autonomy at the University of York, and he's going to help us get into the difficult question of safety assurance. How do we define the right metrics? How do we collect evidence? And how do we decide whether those metrics are sufficient or need to be extended? So I'm going to hand over to Saber. Oh, welcome, John. Say hi.
Thank you very much. Nice to speak to you all.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Saber for the moderation of the panel, and I'll return for the audience questions. So please make sure you use the chat to raise those questions for the panel. And we're also going to be referring to the registration questions that lots of people raised when you registered for the panel. Okay, so over to you, Saber. Are you on mute?
Sorry, it's the legacy of the COVID time. Still. Okay, thank you very much, Claire, for the introduction. Let's start with the very fundamental question. We know that UK AV Act defined the concept of careful and competent driver and asked self-driving entities to provide evidence for that. But the first question is that actually what careful and competent driver actually means. I would like to hear from our panelists to see what they do think and how we can define this concept for the automotive self-driving entities here in the UK and of course globally. So let's start with you, Nick. In terms of ethics and standards, what do we mean by this, or how we can define ethics and standards for the careful and competent driver?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I think that statement in the AV Act and in other regulation regarding automated vehicles is a great kind of foundation for what we will expect as society for the vehicles that are deployed on our streets. But it's a slippery concept. So there's no real kind of clear definition exactly of what that means. We have lots of case law to indicate what it isn't, where standards have fallen below that expected of a careful and competent driver. But yeah, it's difficult to define specifically what that means. And what does it, I think a lot of it comes down to the context, right? So in an open desert, there isn't much you need to do to be a careful and competent driver in that context. In a busy urban environment, there's much more needed to demonstrate that competence. And some of it is not just about keeping between the white lines and stopping for traffic lights. It's about how you interact with all of the other road users, vehicle-based or otherwise, and doing so in an appropriate way, in an intuitive way, in ways that others can understand as well. I think for the most part, the two are aligned, careful and competent. But sometimes there are situations where a driver could show too much care, be too careful, and that might lead you to question, are they competent in that situation? Similarly, you might be a very competent driver, but it might indicate you're not being particularly careful if you drive too fast or too close to another road user. So, yeah, I think it's a great foundation, but there's work to do for companies to be able to demonstrate what it means to prove that they are reaching that standard of careful and competent.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, John. Following Nick's comment, next question, obvious question is that how do we measure careful and competent driver? Do we have any metrics or do we have any definitions for this measuring the careful and competent driver?
So I don't think there are any very simple definitions, as Nick said, but let me try to make a couple of observations that may help. Of course, we have statistics for accident rates for drivers. So at absolute minimum, you would want to see autonomous vehicles doing better than that, as is beginning to happen in some cases. But I wouldn't expect the vehicles to be exactly the same as human beings, and I would expect them to perhaps be better in some circumstances and worse than others. So even if we say that they're better on average, we might expect a shift in the distribution of where they work well and where they don't. I actually think vehicles will do better than humans in time, but that will take experience of these vehicles on the road. One thing that Nick alluded to is interacting with others. Actually driving is a process of social cognition, not just how we maneuver the vehicle. We decide some vehicles being aggressive, so we leave them more space, for example. And that's much harder to measure. It's not recorded in any objective way. So I think some of the deciding of careful and competent will inevitably come down to judgment by the relevant authorities, by the Vehicle and Certification Agency, for example, when they approve vehicles to go on the Secretary of State's list of approved vehicles. So it's a complicated space. We will learn more as the AV Act gets implemented and these trials start.
Thank you very much, John. You raised a few interesting points, but I would like to follow up these points after hearing from Jamie from operational ways. How the self-driving entities can provide evidence for the careful and competent driver. Are they ever able to provide that evidence to governments and or regulatory bodies?
Yeah, so I think obviously lots of very sensible things said thus far by Nick and John. I think the point that's often missed, I think, about the Automated Vehicles Act in the UK is that the focus is very much on the organizations that are developing the technology and operating the services. So we have the concepts of authorized self-driving entity and no user in charge operator. Lots more acronyms for us all to remember. And I think that focus on the organization is really important because it's not just about saying, is the vehicle as an object safe? Because the vehicle is just a sort of robot, if you like. The question is, has the organization developed the vehicle and the service in a suitable way? And I think in terms of the sort of to your specific question around what evidence to supply, it's very much and sort of it's conversations we're having with DFT that it's about, can you demonstrate that you're a reputable organization, that you're doing the right things in the way that you develop the technology, and can you generate the right artifacts, as they'd say. So classic example of this, safety management system, safety case. These are all kind of artifacts, if you like, objects, documents that could be provided to the regulator to give them the confidence that you have developed the system in a proper way and that you have identified the right evidence and that you can justify the behavior of the vehicle on the road. And of course, all of this is informed by, I think it's 8+ years of work at the UN level that's ongoing at the moment to develop a UN ADS regulation, which will set out lots of technical requirements for ASDs in particular. And that's a really important piece of that overall international regulatory picture, to make sure that the right requirements are being met, and that the ASD and whomever else can demonstrate sufficient evidence that they've met those requirements.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Just add one thing. When you say ASD, for those audience that are not familiar with the acronym, it stands for the Automated Self-Driving Entity. Okay, so let's move on to the next question, following John's comment that he said that human and competent driver can be measured by being above the average drivers. Do you think one metric is enough, or we need to have the wider sort of metrics? For example, as a human driver, when I'm driving, I try to avoid the dangerous situations. I try to make sometimes happens that the near misses happen in my driving cases, day-to-day driving. But these things is not easy to measure. And when it comes to the autonomous driving, how we can do that? John, let's start with you. What is the challenge in early assessment of these such situations? What we can do with these cases?
So is that for me, Saber?
Yes, John,
Yeah,
yes.
sure. So I don't think you can just do a single metric sensibly, but it has to be the starting point because it's objectively accessible. I think the rest, require us to do some additional work, some of which, as you rightly said, is about, acceptability to others. So, I would want to do some, trials on public acceptability of the behavior. So, if vehicles don't give way the way that we would expect, that actually might lead to an undermining trust from the point of view of other road users. So we have to do that. But that involves experimentation. And as Nick rightly said, that will be very different in different situations and with different classes of road users. So yes, we need to do a lot more, but I don't think there's any way of getting away from the hard statistics in the long run. Perhaps one other very brief perspective on this. I mean, Jamie will correct me if I remembered wrongly, but I think in the very early days, a lot of the incidents involving Waymos were vehicles driving into them from behind because the other drivers hadn't adjusted to the different way that the autonomous vehicles operated. That now has reduced dramatically, I think, partly because people have got more used to them, but also partly because the driving behavior, the Waymos, have changed. And that's not to be critical of Waymo. I think they're way ahead of anybody else with vehicles on the road, but really to point out that actually behaviors change, and this careful and competent is actually not a static criterion. It will actually evolve over time. And one of the things we have to do is to understand how to track the changes over time and to make sure that they remain acceptable.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, John. I absolutely agree with you, and you raise a really right point that we need to start from somewhere and some metrics, and then expand those metrics after understanding the basics of the careful and competent driver. Jamie, getting back to you, Nick raised the point that competence and careful subjects are different things, and we need to define it. But from the road operator, also from the self-driving entity, I believe that the more complexity comes from the rule compliance. Okay, as a human, we comply to rules, but there are cases, as Nick mentioned in his comments, there are cases that we need to break the rules, not because we are not competent or careful driver, because we care about others. And we want to make, for example, sometimes maybe I break the road rule because I want to save the time, because I want to avoid a traffic jam, or maybe because I want to give way to someone else. So how think this makes the situation for you complicated. How we can manage this role compliance for the autonomous vehicle or AI-driven autonomous vehicles?
Yeah, of course. So again, the Automated Vehicles Act 2024 makes this distinction between safely driving autonomously and legally driving autonomously. And it's the safely driving itself, or driving autonomously, sorry, that relates to the careful and competent. The measure for driving legally, so obeying road rules essentially, I think the language is something along the lines of an exceptionally low risk of committing a traffic infraction. And we know that from the law that the traffic infraction is essentially something that if a human did it, it would be a civil or criminal offence. And what's not quite clear at the moment from UK government is whether they intend to further define traffic infractions, and kind of that key question that you raised, Saber, in terms of how do you balance between these two requirements, basically under the Automated Vehicles Act at a very high level of maintaining safety, but also driving legally. And when they come into conflict, how exactly, what is the UK's expectation of how we, as operators and developers, balance that? In Waymo, we have obviously sort of over 12 years worth of experience of developing safe systems. We have a safety framework that's comprised of about 12 methodologies, and sort of a couple of important methodologies here. One is our collision avoidance testing. So clearly, it's very important that vehicles avoid collisions, and that's obviously a central part of being safe, avoiding causing harm, of course. But we also have a separate VRU methodology that's very much about saying, even once you've conducted the full safety assessment, how do you make sure that there isn't any disproportionate effect on VRUs? Because you might have a vehicle that at the aggregate is very safe, but actually when you look at incidents or whatnot, it's actually a disproportionate effect on VRUs. So that's, again, very important for safety, very important for public acceptance, very important for careful and competent. But we have a separate methodology altogether, which is about road rules compliance. And of course, that's a more difficult one. There's much more cultural nuance. We do a lot of work in all the markets we operate in to make sure that we are trying to absorb as much of that cultural nuance as possible. And then, of course, we work very closely with regulators to ensure that the vehicles are demonstrating suitable driving behaviours. So, yeah, hopefully we'll see a little bit more clarity from UK government about how they're looking at ASDs and newer codes, balancing that sort of two requirements on safety and legal driving.
Oh, thank you very much. It's very useful to hear from as the point of view how to manage this situation. It's really interesting. One thing for the audience, again, when Jamie said VRU stands for the vulnerable road users. So some of the audience may not be familiar with these acronyms. Okay, Jamie, let's continue with that one. So now the question is that we are seeing the robo taxis on London roads, for example, in the UK. And when I was visiting London last time, I saw a few of the Waymo robo taxis on London roads. At the end, they need to provide evidence to authorizations or authority organization to get the authorization to drive these cars on London roads or anywhere in the UK. At this time, what kind of evidence do you think you are able to provide, or not Waymo, any ASD can provide to a UK government or to authority bodies?
So in terms of what evidence should be supplied for this, the initial deployment?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so obviously, although we talk about pilot deployments in the UK, the same level of safety has to be obtained or reached, if you like, for these deployments in as much as in the future. And so, again, we have a very well-developed safety methodology that we've been using for many years in the US. And that's something that we're discussing with UK government at the moment in terms of what's the right kind of evidence that they're looking for in the UK. For those of you who are nerdy enough to read the guidance that was published at the end of March, I believe, there's a whole set of requirements in there around the evidence that government's looking for in terms of how you obtain those pilot approvals. So a really important part of that actually is the UN ADS regulation. So although it's still in draft, we're largely at a final stage of that regulations draft. And there's lots of technical requirements in there around, as I said before, generating a safety management system, developing a safety case. And these are all requirements that the UK government is looking for when they're assessing applicants for approval under the pilot regime. So there's a whole host of information that needs to be provided. But I think it's important to emphasize that, again, although this is a pilot regime, we're sort of learning how we can best deploy AVs in this country. The same standard of safety has to be obtained for these deployments in as much as in the future.
Okay, excellent. John, let's continue with you as a safety assurance expert. I know you have done a great work at York University and Safe Autonomy Institute. From your point of view, as a safety assurance expert, what artifacts the entities as the automated self-driving entities should provide to government and to the public for these purposes?
That's a very big question. So let me try to give you a brief answer to that, some key things. I think it's very important at the whole vehicle level, we understand that the concept of operations and how it will achieve safety under adverse conditions, which might include heavy rain, which obscures sensors, failures of traffic lights, but also internal failures. If a brake actuator fails and the brake locks on, what does the vehicle do? So that safe operating concept is really crucial to know how the vehicle will manage safely in the realistic world environment. And I would expect there to be evidence about how that's defined, but also how it's arrived at through analysis of the environment, analysis of potential technical failures in the vehicle. Where functions are implemented using machine learning, I would then expect to drive down from that system level information about the safety requirements that the sensors have to meet, which will vary across the sensing modalities, what the machine learning algorithms need to do. Then evidence from development of the algorithms, their verification, and so on to feedback. So abstractly, this needs to be quite general, quite broad, quite deep. What do the regulators need? I think the answer is quite wide visibility of the processes that have been gone through and samples of evidence to show that those processes have actually been implemented. In practice, a lot of the development work and the verification will be done in simulation. I believe that there are probably many millions of miles driven a day in simulation. There's no way a regulator could see all of that, realistically assess it. But they need to see enough samples of that they can have confidence that not only are the plans good, they've been implemented well. They also need some visibility of how that evolves while the systems are in service. And it also needs to be done in such a way it protects company intellectual property. But I think working with a regulator, that can be done. I think with the public, it's much more tricky. I would not expect them to understand much of that detail. And I think my starting point would be what they should see is that the regulator is happy, as happens with aircraft. And I wouldn't expect them necessarily to have any visibility of that. And actually, in that sense, what Waymo publishes is beyond what I would necessarily expect to be made available to the public. So I hope that helps. But I say it is a complex question.
Thanks. You raised two interesting topics. One is the role of simulations, and another one is the public view. I will go to those part later. But before that, I would like Nick has raised his hand. So Nick, go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, I'm enjoying listening to Jamie and John. I'm struck by the difference between what we expect of human drivers and what we are having to do in order to demonstrate that automated vehicles are safe. The process in the UK, at least, driving lessons, and then one test, theory test, and then a practical test of 30 minutes, 45 minutes. And then you're allowed to drive more or less anywhere in more or less any car-like vehicle. And we do that because we trust that humans have an instinct for self-preservation and don't want to hurt other people, and that they want to follow the rules by and large. And if they don't follow the rules, they understand that there are consequences for not doing so. We don't have that for automated vehicles. We cannot have that immediate trust in the instinct of an electronic system. So, I mean, as Jamie was saying, Waymo has 12 different methodologies about proving the safety of the vehicles, and there's sort of different levels to the evidence, right? There's the evidence to show what has been done in preparing the vehicle for deployment, which might include test track, which might include simulation, which might include evidence around algorithms and so on. There's evidence around what you've done for the deployment that you're wishing to deliver. And then there's the ongoing evidence thereafter to show that your vehicles are continuing to be safe and are living up to the standards that you reported in that preparatory safety case. And I think there's work needed there in how we prove on an ongoing basis and in a way that is practical and acceptable both to the public, but also is sort of manageable and viable for the ASDs, the developers and the operators, to be able to give that ongoing evidence of safe operation. And it can't be at the level of incidents only. It has to be something more about the level of risk that the vehicles are experiencing or causing, and enable a regulator to help the operators manage their vehicles and manage the risk to other road users and the communities where the vehicles are deployed.
Thank you very much, Nick. It was really interesting. One thing I picked up from your comments and discussions is that you are talking about safe vehicle or safe AI driver. But is safety assurance or safety is enough, or do we need to have a wider? We talk about safety and trust, public trust. Okay, so I would like to hear from Claire about this one. She's expert in the public side. So from your point of view, Claire, we have different road users. We have pedestrians, we have cyclists, we have disabled people, other type of young drivers, elder drivers. Each of them have different expectation. Okay, what do you think? How do public see proving the autonomous car is safe by statistical data is enough, or we need to look at something more in this part to bring the trust to public, not just safety to the public?
Yeah, it's a really, really good angle, because a strong safety case may satisfy the regulator, but it's not automatically the same as having that public trust, because the public might want to know, what does this mean, or what does it mean for me? And you talk, Saber, about like different types of groups might need different reassurance. So you mentioned pedestrians and cyclists and disabled people. They might not define safe in the same way. And we need to ask who's really being heard on this. Obviously, we need the vehicle to be technically safe. But there was another webinar this morning, and Rebecca Posner was talking on that panel, and she made a great point about acceptance or acceptability, that it shouldn't really be about convincing the public that it's safe. It's also that, you know, a lot of the work that I'm doing, people will say, I trust that it's going to be safe. I trust that the government would put it on the road unless it's safe. But is it safe for me? And that perception of safety is what's so important. And really, what are we doing as an industry, other than having these great conversations and promoting these kinds of outreach and you know, kind of discussions on areas like LinkedIn? Where is the general public involved in this kind of conversation? And I know that Waymo do a lot of work with stakeholder and advocacy groups. I've done a lot of work from the university level with, you know, bringing in people from all different kinds of protected characteristics. But as part of this safety case, there needs to be a much bigger way for people to understand the technology, to be able to ask questions, challenge the assumptions, and really tailor the message to different concerns rather than just saying it's fine, you know, technology is going to work. It's actually meet them where they're at in terms of, is it a visceral emotional fear? Is it, I just don't think I need it? Is it what happens next? Is it going to be in my village or area? So these need to happen sort of early enough to shape the evidence and the design and the communication, and not just do it after all the decisions have been made and they're on the road. So I would say very much now is the time to try and reach out to those audiences.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting and very valid point, Claire. What I will always argue is that we need to move on with the safe. We need to be careful when we say the safe AI driver or safe AV. We need to talk about trustworthiness rather than safety. Safety is the factor of trustworthiness, not everything for the trust, being the car be trusted by public. So again, in terms of the safety assurance, I rather use this assurance to make sure that the car is AI or car. I don't separate this; both are the same. Are trustable and not just only safe. Nick, you
I'm
raised.
I'm going to use moderators' rights to just jump in ahead of Nick, because I know that I think it's also, like you say, we have experience, probably all of us, of being in a car with someone that we didn't feel safe with.
Mhm.
And what did it take for us to trust them again before we had to get in the car? And sometimes we didn't get to make that choice because there was no other way. We had to get in the car with the person the next time. Maybe because they were a parent and we didn't have that authority over them to say, your driving makes me nervous. Or maybe it's because you're a school kid, or maybe you depend on that public transport to get you somewhere to go to work. So we need to be putting this in place, that people have that autonomy to make choices about the transport that they use, but that they can actually contribute towards that safe enough. Sorry, Nick, just got a bit passionate there.
Nick, please.
No, absolutely. You're the expert in this area. I was struck by I think the evidence emerging now where people are choosing to use Waymo vehicles in the US because of their feelings of safety within them. So that but there are also new safety risks as well that are introduced. So we need to take steps to manage those. And then keeping an eye on Sandra's question in the chat around the accessibility point. And I think it's safety and accessibility have always been the kind of professed benefits or promised benefits of automated driving. And it's jarring sometimes to see vehicle types emerging that don't necessarily provide that accessibility that's been promised. I can understand that, because you want to use platforms that enable you to build the evidence that automated driving is safe and do that in a practical way. Now that is genuinely happening, I think there is the opportunity to move to other vehicles that can deliver that accessibility, and that's something we as a panel, all of the attendees to this meeting and beyond, can be vigilant for, to see that those accessibility lessons are being learned in this new world of services provided by automated vehicles.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much. Jamie, one question for you. One thing that I always discuss, I hear from experts that the ISD needs to look at the safety assurance made by airlines and aeroplanes cases. And they say that, okay, when you have a flight and you're using airplanes, you don't care who's the pilot, and you just trust them because of the safety assurance process, strong safety assurance process behind these services. But my question is that how much is that transferable from aerospace or airplane or airlines to autonomous driving? What do you think in that angle?
Well, I'm sure some aviation safety experts can correct me, but I think pilot error is the main cause of incidents involving aircraft. So maybe there is a lesson to be learned there. I mean, I think, you know, the point here that is transferable, and there's been a lot of discussion over the years that the law commissions looked at this, right? That aviation has developed over the last 100 plus years of ensuring that there are proper processes in place, that there are the right operators, organizations involved, and that's what we're carrying across into the Automated Vehicles Act. this isn't so much a focus on the vehicle, actually. This is a focus on the organization standing behind those vehicles, because the vehicles can't be responsible for what they do, and ensuring that they have done sufficient work and testing and engagement with communities, as Waymo does, to ensure that the vehicle is both safe but also trustworthy. I mean, there's a reason why Waymo's mission is to be the world's most trusted driver, because we recognize that, as a service provider, in as much as a technology developer, we have to, and we see the value of engaging in communities, because if we don't design the vehicles or the service to meet their expectations, then people won't use the service, or there will be pushback against the service. And a point sort of linking the question that Sandra was raising and something Nick was saying, we work with women's groups who historically, feel sometimes unsafe in using existing forms of transport. And one of the concerns that was raised to us in the US was that some riders who are women were finding that the vehicles were dropping them off in places that they didn't like. And so working with those groups, there's now an option on the app and also inside the vehicle, where if you're not happy with the lighting of essentially where you've arrived, and the vehicle will check this itself, but if you arrive at a drop-off location that is poorly lit, or for any other reason, to be honest, you can move the vehicle along to somewhere that you're more comfortable getting out of. And I think that, that's not so much about the vehicle, really. That's about the service provision. And I think when we talk about accessibility, it's easy to forget that actually you have to provide a very comprehensive service in as much as an accessible vehicle, to ensure that people can actually use this technology to get from where they are to where they want to be.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Jamie. Okay, I'm a little conscious of time, so I merged next to my questions together and ask everyone. John raised the role of the simulations. Of course, simulations play a huge role on the safety assurance of the autonomous cars. But as John said, it's not enough, because out in the world, there are many cases that we cannot predict or we cannot simulate in the simulation platform. But how do you see how much should be inside through the simulation, and how much should be on the real world testing? Okay, and the other question is that I asked you this question before, but Jamie, I would like to ask again for our audience to know your opinion about it. I asked you how much data as they are willing to give to the authorities. And you said that the problem is here is that they don't know what data need, okay? And you cannot provide all data to authorities because it's a huge amount of data. So from your point of view, I would like to hear after you from John as well. First, how much is simulation is important? And then what minimum data as they should provide to governments or to authorities for showing the safe and careful and competent driver or safety of the autonomous car?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of simulation, so yeah, obviously it's a very important part of what we do. A key requirement in the UN, the forthcoming UN ADS regulation, is looking at the sort of fidelity of your simulations. So to ensure that when you do use simulations, they are representative of where you want to deploy. And that's obviously really important. And one of the concerns often with using simulation is, well, it doesn't reflect the real world. But obviously that's a really important part of international regulation. And actually, in some ways, we've shown this not too long ago, that you can use simulation in a way of sort of adversarially testing the vehicle. You can throw an elephant in front of the vehicle because it's something it won't see, but you can see how it might react to that in simulation, and that helps you understand where your weaknesses might be. In terms of minimal data sets, I mean, yeah, this is a conversation as old as time itself, I think. And it would sort of be hard to summarize quickly sort of all the different data sets we have to share. But I think the point to make here is that, again, UN ADS regulation, there's a whole suite of data sharing requirements in terms of safety performance, not just collisions, but also just generally. And then if we look at the UK regime, we expect to see some data sharing requirements relating to things like a change in financial situation for the ASD, because we have this in other jurisdictions as well. it's just as important to make sure that the entity is doing the right thing in as much as the vehicle is doing the right thing. So, I think a lot of this is fairly standardized at this point. And that's the role of regulation, to make sure that everyone's playing on the same field, as it were, and that there is a sort of a role for government in making sure that the right data is being shared.
Thank you very much, Jamie. It's always good to hear the opinion from the point of view. John, you as well as a safety assurance expert, what do you think?
Sure. I mean, let me try to complement what Jamie said. One of the important things with simulation is to be clear about what you're doing it for. And I think in many cases in simulation, you're trying to deal with the off-nominal situation. Sometimes we use the term edge cases. I don't particularly like that term. So we can simulate high levels of fog, rain, children running out in front of a car, which either we can't collect the data in the real world or it's actually too dangerous to do. So for me, it's partly about generating general confidence in the behavior of the vehicle, but it's dealing with those situations I wouldn't want to do in the real world. Jamie talked about validation of the fidelity of the simulation. I think that's very important too. We also need to be careful that we're, measuring a sensible thing. So one of the autonomous vehicle companies I work with decided doing photorealistic simulations for sensors wasn't very sensible. What was much more useful was understanding the error distribution of the cameras and to ensure that the machine learning elements were robust against those. And so about data sharing, not much to add to what Jamie said, but I think one of the things the community needs to understand is what things are important enough that they should be shared across competitive companies because they matter so much to public safety, and those which are much more localized to that particular supplier, and therefore don't need to be shared. And I think it will take time for us to work out how to make those decisions. But I think that's something we need to do to allow fair competition, but also to allow public safety to take precedence where that's appropriate.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Nick, please go ahead if you want to add something.
Yeah, Jamie said it's a discussion that's been going on since the dawn of time. It feels like it sometimes. Sort of relevant to this, there was the work that I did with colleagues for BSI, British Standards Institution, reviewed the standards that are available or relevant to automated driving, and recognized that one of the gaps was safety assurance. So they commissioned some work to determine what would be a standardized process for assessing the safety of an automated vehicle. And I mean, in part, that was to do with not only offering that assurance, but also to kind of get underneath the asymmetry in kind of data and resources and computing power that exists on the side of the AV developers versus the regulators whose job it is to make sure that the vehicles continue to operate safely. So we came up with this approach, which we called digital commentary driving, that it would be a standardized mechanism, standardized format for collecting data, which would reflect the information that a vehicle must know if it's to operate safely. What things is it seeing? What predictions is it making about how those entities might be moving? What confidence does it have in those predictions? And then how is it going to adapt its driving behavior in response? It's not perfect, but I think in terms of giving you that level of assurance and supporting public perceptions of trust about the safety of vehicles, it would enable you to create tools that a regulator can use and apply those tools to the data, regardless of which operator was providing them. Because it's in that standardized approach, whether it was Waymo or any other AV developer, it would enable them to give insights into whether those vehicles are operating safely. So that's something I've been working on for a while. I think something like it will have to emerge, whether it is DCD exactly, the digital commentary driving as we created it, or something along those lines. It feels like we will get somewhere near what that aimed to achieve, and I'll keep working towards it.
You know that, Nick, I always advocate the concept of digital commentary driver. I think we need to set up another separate webinar to discuss the concept of the digital driving, digital commentary driver. But because of this time, I need to move on. So let's wrap up this one. I'm a little cautious of time because we want to answer some questions from the audience as well. Very quickly, if each of you tell me, what would you, each of you, want to see before saying an AI driver had met the careful and competent threshold? Again, we talk about the safety, we talk about AVs, but to me, AI and AV are not separable. The driver is AI. So how, what do you see here? What do you want, evidence do you want to see if is AI driver is a competent and careful driver? If you go the 30 seconds each of you, I really appreciate that to give the audience to answer the questions as well. Okay, John, would you like to start first?
Okay. A safety case sufficient to say we can deploy in the real world on a small scale and gain further data to validate that the pre-deployment assessment was accurate.
Thank you, John. Jamie?
I suppose I'm a little bit biased, but I'd like to see UK government approval of Waymo vehicles.
Okay, that's a very valid point. Short, concise, clear, Jamie. I really like it. Nick, please.
I think as a basic level, it's that statistical proof of safety, of a reduction in collisions causing death and serious injury, but then ongoing proof to show that the vehicles are operating safely and seeing and doing everything they need to do in order to be considered as operating safely. You know, that statistical measure is of no comfort to the family members of someone who's been killed as a result of a crash. So we need to know that the vehicles are behaving themselves in the way we as experts, but we as society expect them to.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. So, Claire, I hand over to you to ask questions ask the questions from the panelists that audience have asked. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Saber, for moderating. And that was obviously a very interesting discussion, and it has raised a lot of questions. We'll start with one that's kind of come back to quite a few different variations of it in the chat about having the UK approach of this careful and competent human driver, but that those cross-national variations in driving culture and road user behaviour mean that possibly that transferability is going to alter from environment or region. And we also have a lot of people on the road in the UK who might not have got their driver's license in the UK but are still able to drive. So particularly for sort of international friends who are coming from the US to drive on our roads. And there are a lot of elements about this cross-cultural element. So I'm going to come to Nick first, with your background, obviously, in psychology. This is an area that you'll know a lot about. Do you want to talk a little bit about what we might want to see that would show that an ASD has considered that they are thinking about the culture of the place that they are driving or offering a service in?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can reflect that in the safety case and show that you've done your homework. You understand the local nuances and you have adapted the technology to align with those. But also, going back to this idea of what data you collect to show that you're operating safely. If you're collecting that data and you're going to assess whether something is safe, you need a threshold. And then I think, depending on where you operate, the thresholds might be different. So it would then be for a country to decide what they would consider to be safe and acceptable versus other locations. So UK has a good safety record. We might set the bar relatively high, whereas others, the bar might be lower. So yeah, I think that once we get into that ability to monitor in an objective manner, we get also the ability to manage that across different territories.
Okay, and so John, you have your hand up. Do you agree, or do you think data is universal? The data will show what culture is irrelevant.
No, I don't. I don't think it's universal. So I agree with Nick on that. But I think also, behaviours matter. Somebody some time ago asked me if I thought it would be hard for Waymos to adapt from the right-hand side of the road to the left. And of course, it's not trivial. But I don't think that's the big issue. And again, Jamie's view would be interesting. But I think it's the different driving behaviours, the behaviour of VRUs, people like me as pedestrians who cross the roads at places that they're not meant to, which is, quite common. So I think it's actually dealing with those national and local characteristics that are much harder than the difference in the, in the published rules.
Okay, so thanks for that's obviously the sort of data side of it. What about the practicality then? How do you consider those cross-cultural variations, Jamie, if you're trying to come into a new market?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of obviously, I don't think there's any country in the world where they don't oppose collisions with injuries. So from that perspective, avoiding collisions is important across countries. Obviously, the difference is in terms of the behaviours that underpin the overall driving, and obviously you don't want to get to the point of collision. And road rules are a good starting point. Often there are actually lots of similarities between road rules, but between countries. So we see a lot of similarities in road rules from the US to the UK. But obviously, part of, and I think this is what Nick said at the beginning, part of the due diligence that we must conduct is to ensure that there are, if there are requirements in the UK that are different, if there are expectations that are different, whether that's with community groups or among experts, we need to ensure that those things are reflected in how the vehicle drives itself, because ultimately we need the approval of government, and if government isn't satisfied with how the vehicle performed, then they won't approve us. We ourselves wouldn't put our vehicles on the road unless we were happy with the output. But even once the vehicles are out on the road, again, public perception is super important. If people are dissatisfied with the way that vehicles are driving, they will make themselves known, and that might involve the regulators. So yes, there are variations, but the onus is on the developer, the operator, to ensure that they are conducting the due diligence, that they are collecting the relevant evidence of that local jurisdiction and making sure that the vehicle complies with those expectations.
And Nick, you want to come in on that?
Yeah, no, it's just a twist on this whole discussion of careful and competent, really. If we get to a point where we're able to provide that data-led objective measure of careful and competent driving for automated vehicles, it might give us insights that mean we hold humans to higher standards in future, right? We know human behavior is at the root of many of the crashes that happen on our roads. We're getting much more telematic data now about the way vehicles are behaving and how drivers are behaving. So it might give us opportunities to hold drivers to a higher standard of care and competence than we do today.
Okay, interesting perspective. And I can see that as well in the chat, people, this idea of a careful and competent human driver, yes, careful and competent and safe, but also what about careful for sustainability in the environment? So many of the questions are about the fact that some AVs may circle the block. They might be waiting for fares, particularly during the stages of mapping where you're getting used to new markets. There may be a lot of driving around without taking on fares, and that this could worsen congestion and air quality if it results in sort of an actual net increase in traffic. So what is the panel's view on the likelihood of this risk becoming a reality? And that's from George Beard from TOL. Let's go with John first. So from a sort of safety assurance perspective, is this something that's considered?
I think normally safety processes wouldn't, consider pollution from driving around empty as a harm, although there's actually no reason why they shouldn't. And as well as safety frameworks, we worked on ethical frameworks, and that's the sort of thing that would be considered within that. But to be fair to the providers of these services, it's actually quite tricky. If they're dropping somebody off where they want to be, that's not necessarily a place where they can park for an extended period of time. And certainly, even if there's, say, a meter there, the car doesn't have a robot inside that can get out and put money in the meter. So I think it's actually quite a tricky thing. operationally, and I would look to sort of fleet management software to, to minimize this and, optimize the number of vehicles that are out at any one time, based on the level of demand that's being made. But I don't think there is a simple solution to that. But I'm sure the companies are interested in that as well, because driving around costs them money directly, but also in terms of wear on the vehicles.
Yeah, yeah, an interesting side. I think it's a shared problem. Nick, if you want to come in.
Yes, yeah. I think, in addition to measuring safety, we need metrics that understand how automated vehicle-based services are contributing to the transport picture for a city or the region where they're deployed. So it might not just be, how many trips are being completed, but how many people are able to reach particular services or jobs or education as a result of that deployment. And if you can show that's increasing and you're meeting the demands of a community, then that's a good thing. If you're creating issues, then you might need to change the way in which the service is regulated. But yeah, that different style of metric beyond safety is really important. That's a good question.
Yeah, because it comes back to the idea of ethics that was raised in the title of this, kind of webinar, that it's not just about safety, it's not just about the service, being technically right, it's also the ethics of delivering a service. So Jamie, in the hot spot really, because the only one on the panel he's doing that. How much does this factor in considerations at Waymo and perhaps other software providers and developers that you know?
In terms of the sort of operation distribution of the fleet?
In terms of the kind of safety and the ethics of the this type of service, possibly the circling or the pollution element.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I mean, this is a really important point, and I see it's come up several times in the questions. And unsurprisingly, it's something that comes up with particularly European cities, but also American jurisdictions as well. There's absolutely no incentive for us to circulate the fleet empty. If nothing else, you just wear out your assets. So if they're doing empty miles, it's just a waste of that asset. And I think the point here that often is missed maybe about self-driving vehicles and particularly Waymos is that we have a highly efficient fleet. So our operating area now across 11 cities is roughly 1,400 square miles. We're offering over 500,000 trips per week. And people think, well, you must have tens of thousands of vehicles to do that. And we have roughly 3,000. So that's 3,000 vehicles covering 11 cities. On average, and you can look at the California regulators' data for this, but on average, our vehicles are completing about 24 trips per day. And if you compare that to sort of the average taxi or PHV in London, that's sort of double the number of trips. And so although you have a smaller fleet, you're doing many more trips with them, and you're doing those with passengers. So we have total control of the fleet. We could distribute them where we need them. It's a much more efficient way of operating a fleet of vehicles. And it's for those reasons that we think actually they have a strong role to play as part of a wider transport network. They're not going to be the only vehicles on the road, but they have a role to play in providing those point-to-point journeys, and they can do so much more efficiently.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all of you very much for a really interesting discussion. I hope that the audience felt that we went to different places as well, rather than covering, sort of the same kind of conversations and ground. But there's a lot more mileage, sorry for the pun, in this conversation. I don't think this is the last we're hearing about this careful and competent human driver and how we're actually going to measure it. But I thank John, Nick, and Jamie, and thanks also to Saber. And thank you very much, everyone. There'll be a recording of this seminar for anyone who missed it. Take care and have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Right.